It was the winter of 1944, and the American line was breaking. Somewhere along a frozen road in the Ardennes forest, a general was retreating. His men were pulling back. His vehicles were moving in the wrong direction. And word had just reached George S. Patton that one of his own commanders was abandoning ground that soldiers had bled to take. Patton listened to the report. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He simply asked one question. Where is he right now? 20 minutes later, Patton's Jeep was already moving. Before we go any further into this story, if you want more untold moments from the men who shaped World War II, hit that subscribe button. New videos every week. Because what happened on that frozen road in December 1944 tells you everything you need to know about what made Patton different from every other general in the United States Army. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what was happening around it. The Battle of the Bulge had exploded onto the Allied front on December 16, 1944. Hitler had gambled everything on a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same dense forest region the Germans had used to blindside the French in 1940. The attack caught the Americans completely off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded. Communication lines collapsed. Commanders at every level were making desperate decisions in conditions they had never trained for. Snow, ice, fog so thick that air support was impossible, and a German assault so powerful and so unexpected that even experienced commanders began to doubt whether the line could hold. Most American generals at that moment were in crisis mode. They were reacting. They were calling for reinforcements, requesting permission to fall back, trying to stabilize situations that seemed to be collapsing faster than they could respond. Retreat felt like survival. Holding ground felt like suicide. And in that environment, a general who ordered his men to pull back wasn't necessarily a coward. He might have genuinely believed he was saving lives. But Patton didn't see it that way. Patton believed, with absolute conviction, that retreat was contagious. That the moment you allowed one unit to fall back without a fight, you planted a seed of doubt in every unit around it. That doubt spread. It moved through a formation the way fire moved through dry grass. Invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. He had seen it happen. He had spent his entire career studying military history, reading about the moments when armies collapsed not because they were outgunned, but because someone, somewhere, decided that the ground they were standing on wasn't worth dying for. Patton refused to let that happen in his army. Not on his watch. Not ever. When the report reached him that one of his divisional commanders, a general we will call by his rank to protect the historical record where accounts differ, had ordered a withdrawal from a position that Patton had personally designated as critical to the defensive line, Patton's reaction was not what most people would expect. He didn't explode. He didn't get on the radio and start screaming. He got in his Jeep. Because Patton understood something that most commanders forgot in moments of crisis. A voice on a radio could be ignored, questioned, or explained away. A three-star general standing in front of you on a frozen road, in person, looking you directly in the eyes, could not be ignored, could not be explained away, could not be anything except exactly what it was. When Patton's Jeep reached the retreating column, the scene was chaotic. Vehicles were moving backward along a narrow road. Soldiers were on foot, heads down against the wind, moving with the exhausted shuffle of men who had stopped believing in the objective. The general was near the front of the column, sitting in his own vehicle, maps spread across his lap, already planning his next defensive position further back. He looked up when Patton's jeep pulled alongside him and felt the temperature in his chest drop several degrees when he saw who was standing up in the passenger seat. Patton got out of the jeep. He walked to the general's vehicle. He didn't salute. He didn't extend his hand. He simply said, "Stop this column right now." The general started to explain. His position had been flanked. His casualties were mounting. He had received intelligence suggesting the German force to his north was larger than previously estimated. He had made the decision to re-establish his line further back, where the terrain was more defensible. He said all of this quickly, the way a man speaks when he knows, somewhere deep in his gut, that the person in front of him is not going to accept a single word of it. Patton let him finish. He stood in the snow, in the freezing air of the Ardennes winter, and he let the general say everything he had to say. Then he looked at him with the expression that soldiers who served under Patton described as the look. Not anger, not contempt, something colder than both. He said, "You have 60 seconds to turn this column around. After that, I will personally relieve you of command and find someone who will." The general stared at him. 60 seconds. He had not misheard. Patton was giving him 1 minute, standing there in the middle of a retreating column on a frozen road in the middle of the deadliest German offensive of the entire war, and telling him he had 60 seconds to reverse everything. The general began to protest again. The flanking force, the casualties, the terrain, the intelligence reports. Patton talked over every word. "I don't want to hear about their flanking force. I don't want to hear about your casualties. Every man on this front has casualties. Every unit has a flanking threat. The difference between you and the men who are holding their ground right now is that they are still fighting, and you are not. You have 50 seconds. What happened next was not a dramatic conversion. It was not the moment a man found his courage in a burst of inspiration. It was simpler and more human than that. The general looked at Patton, and he understood that the choice in front of him was real. He could continue to argue, and Patton would relieve him on the spot, hand command to the next officer in the column, and drive away. Or he could turn the column around and fight. He had about 40 seconds to decide which version of himself he was going to be. He chose. He got out of his vehicle. He walked to the front of the column, and in a voice loud enough to carry over the wind, he ordered his men to halt, turn around, and advance back to their original position. The transformation of that column in the minutes that followed was something witnesses would describe for years afterward. Men who had been shuffling backward with their heads down were suddenly moving forward. Not with enthusiasm, not with the energy of soldiers on the offensive, but with the grim, lockjaw determination of men who had been reminded what they were supposed to be doing. Vehicles turned around on a road barely wide enough to manage it. Unit commanders began shouting orders. The retreat reversed itself, and within 30 minutes, the column was moving back toward the position it had abandoned. Patton watched until the column was moving in the right direction. Then he got back in his jeep. His aide, who had stood beside him through the entire exchange, reportedly asked him what he would have done if the general had refused. Patton didn't hesitate. "Relieved him and driven the column myself," he said. And every man who knew George Patton understood that was not a figure of speech. The position was retaken. The line held. Whether that particular piece of ground contributed directly to the eventual Allied breakthrough is a question military historians continue to debate. What is not debated is what happened to the soldiers in that column in the days that followed. They held. They pushed back. They fought with a tenacity that their after-action reports described as remarkable given the conditions. Because something had happened on that road that went beyond orders and tactics and military strategy. A general had come to them in person. He had stood in the same frozen air they were breathing. He had looked their commander in the eye and refused to accept the idea that American soldiers could not hold that ground. And whether they admitted it or not, that mattered. It mattered in the place where courage actually lives, which is not in training manuals or battle plans, but in the moment when a man has to decide whether to keep moving forward or stop. Patton never mentioned this incident in his public speeches. He didn't use it as an example in his talks to his troops. For Patton, it wasn't a story. It was just a Tuesday. It was just what commanding an army meant. You went where the crisis was. You stood in front of the man who was making the wrong decision, and you gave him exactly enough time to make the right one. Not an hour, not a lengthy discussion with maps and intelligence reports. 60 seconds. Because Patton believed that most men, when confronted with the real choice between honor and retreat, already knew what the right answer was. They just needed someone to stand in front of them and refuse to let them choose otherwise. That is the story of what happened on that frozen road. A general retreating, a 60-second ultimatum, and a column of American soldiers who turned around and held the line because George Patton showed up and gave them no other choice. If you want to hear about the moment Patton faced down an SS commandant who was holding 30,000 American POWs hostage and refused to leave without them, that video is next. Hit subscribe and do not miss it.